Hey, we are live. Thank you so much for spending the time with us. Welcome to the webinar with the WP Engine's VP of Growth, David Vogelpohl. David, thank you so much for coming on.
Of course. Thanks, Jan. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And a big thank you to WP Engine for being one of the gold sponsors and contributing majorly into making this event happen. We are going to talk about what it takes to scale your agency and freelance business for growth. And I'm very excited to dive into the plethora of experience that you have, David. But before we do that, can you give us a little intro about who you are and what you are doing in the WordPress space?
Sure. My name's, of course, David Vogelpohl. I'm the VP of Growth at WP Engine. So my primary mission is, of course, driving growth within WP Engine, but by delivering value to our customers so they grow in their business. That's how we look at the value of our platform. I've been in digital for over 20 years. I started my career in 1996 for an ISP and hosting company. Worked in-house for a long time, and then in 2010 started a WordPress agency that I owned and operated for 5 years. I exited from the agency as part of an asset acquisition and then joined WP Engine, who is actually a client of my agency, in 2015 and have been there ever since. So that's a little bit of a window. I also do a lot in the Genesis community and support WordPress and open source and various special missions.
That is really exciting. And off camera, I was asking you to not dive into all the projects because you have so much going on. If you want to learn more about what David is doing, go to davidvogelpohl.com and learn about everything that he has going on. It's a lot. Michael Wright, thanks for being with us. We have a success today. That is so cool. Yesterday, the webinar didn't happen due to technical issues with StreamYard. And now we're finally making it happen here. This is really, really exciting. David, we have some questions prepared for this conversation so that we have an outline of what we need to talk about. And I would love to start with the very fundamentals of building a business, and that is choosing the right type of company. So say, for example, we want an agency that grows, that can accommodate a larger team. We don't want to stay a freelancer. What type of company is the best choice for that?
Yeah, I think there's more considerations to think about rather than me giving people specific advice on how to structure their business. I mean, you definitely need to be talking to a lawyer and perhaps other advisors to make this decision. It's also relevant to the country that you're in and the type of work that you're going to be doing. I'll tell you a little bit about my experience and my journey in that to help frame how you might think about these decisions. When I founded my agency, I founded it as a sole proprietorship in the US. That basically means a business that represents an individual. In other countries, it will have different names or similar structures. What I found, though, after the first year is as I started to scale the business, there were some parts that kept coming up that were a little weird. For example, my bank, when they would collect a payment from someone's credit card on my behalf, the company name was listed as David Vogelpohl, DBA Marketing Click, which is the name of my agency. And that didn't provide a very good brand experience. Now, I was familiar with these other aspects, but they're super important. And for whatever reason, I founded it as a sole proprietorship. But the other big concern is liability. So in the US, and which of course is what I'm most familiar with, you have different types of corporations that you can, and LLPs and things like that, where there's different aspects of liability. Now, the reason this is important is that if you choose a company structure or a corporate structure where liability for the company's actions sits with the company instead of you as an individual, then that provides you a lot of protection. Now, you might be thinking, well, look, I just build kind of simple websites. This isn't that big a deal. You never know what's going to happen. You could have a downtime that you introduce. You could have other security issues that you might get connected to. There could be all kinds of reasons why you get sued. Somebody walks through your office door, trips on something and breaks their leg. These are all liabilities that could come back to you as an individual. So my general recommendation is to choose a company structure where the liability sits with the company, not you as an individual. And then the other mistake a lot of young entrepreneurs, or kind of early in their entrepreneurial journey, entrepreneurs do is they'll also do, at least in the US, what's called piercing the veil. And this is where you use company assets for personal things. Now, if you're the only owner, you might be thinking, well, what difference does it make? I'm going to pay taxes on it if I do it this way or the other way. You actually can get in trouble for tax evasion, or if you are using assets in that way from a company. But the other thing to consider is that, at least in the US, this is called piercing the veil. So that immunity you have as part of the corporate structure from liabilities, you don't have if you're commingling your personal and business assets. So I'm just explaining again my journey. This is definitely not legal advice or corporate formation advice, but these are some of the considerations you need to think about as you think about what type of company is best for your business.
Yeah, and you hit some very important points, and I think thinking back to my experience when I started my business, the first company I founded was with my best friend. And that also was a limited liability company here, the counterpart here in Germany. And the reason was that we were equipping offices essentially. So he would do all the wiring and cables and setting up servers and stuff. I was on the website. But then just recently, with all these laws that are coming into place, like GDPR, CCPA, all the accessibility stuff that is coming up with regulations and stuff like that, you really don't know what somebody's going to sue you for. It's just a matter of time, I think. It's not the question if, it's the question when. And I speak from experience. I've been sued for using images that I wasn't supposed to use back in the days. So it's definitely not the best idea to be liable yourself for what you're doing with the company. I totally agree with that, David.
Yeah, and the load of starting a proper, limited liability company in whatever context is usually actually not that high. People think of it as this very complex thing. The way I facilitated doing it in my business was I hired an attorney who helped me navigate that process. There are DIY ways to do this, but even the lawyer route was not terribly expensive. Especially after I'd waited a year after starting the agency. So we had kind of scaled revenue and stuff by that point, where that kind of expense wasn't, harmful to the operations of the business.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And I've used my company works.com to, even from Germany, install a business in the US. So even that's possible. And depending on the use case, it might make sense or it might not. But it is a very important topic, and I'm glad that we are bringing this up in the very beginning of this conversation. Now, when it comes to the company name, you also referred to the branding aspect and being perceived as a serious business, quote unquote. What do you think about evaluating your brand when it's just you over the entire team? And is a brand more than you really are?
Yeah, that's a deep question. I would say I mentioned the branding piece in terms of my invoices. And for smaller clients, it wasn't that big a deal. It was maybe even a help because they saw it as, an individual. I'm going to get a cheaper price. I'm getting good work, but this isn't a big brand where I'm going to be paying a lot of overhead. But of course, that force worked against me as I started to try to get bigger clients. What I see with my friends, and of course myself, that have started freelancing and agency businesses, is they tend to take one of two paths. Either the brand is centered around the individual because the individual has their own following or is charismatic in some way. And then, of course, other freelancers and agencies that take a more abstracted brand approach. I think both paths are viable. I think it just depends on what you want out of your business, the kind of customers you want to go after, and how you see your business growing. So I'm okay personally if people choose the centered around an individual brand versus the abstracted brand. But the benefits of the abstracted brand is that you can often get higher end clients that way because it's not tied to you as an individual. The other benefit, of course, is you're not implying that you personally have to work on every single project, as is implied on a person-centric brand. And then finally, if you ever want to sell your agency, and I think that's the other thing people need to think about, even though you're just starting this small little business in the beginning, or maybe you just have it, think about selling it. Because if it's all centered on you, that's going to make it nearly impossible to sell in the future. So that's how I think about those considerations.
Yeah, and that's very deep indeed. And I want to recommend the book Build to Sell from David Vogelpohl, I think it is. Build to Sell is a really good blueprint. It's like a fictional story of some agency owner who has essentially the brand built around himself, and he's dealing with all the important clients and he's dealing with all the projects. And then his mentor guides him through restructuring the agency so that he eventually can sell it. Which brings me on to the next question, and that is, when we are starting the business and at some point, eventually we will experience issues with our capacity. There's only so many hours we can work in the day. Should we hire full-time, part-time, or should we contract out to subcontractors?
Of course, it depends a little bit on the specifics. I remember when I hired my first full-time employee, it was probably 3 months after starting the agency. One of the things in the US for me that was driving this was you get better health coverage as part of a group health insurance plan versus buying individual coverage. And so that was important for me and my family. And you only had to have one, I think it's still true, one employee to qualify your company for a group health care plan. So that was actually the driver for me. And of course, as you think about those you might hire, benefits and things like that can also play into these considerations. Full-time employees are definitely, in my opinion, as you grow your agency, a necessary step. I think you can get a long way with contractors, filling in gaps, increasing your capacity in moments where your core team is already spoken for, if you will. So I used freelancers heavily in my business, but what I ended up finding is when I managed these people, their attrition was higher than a full-time employee. And then the other problem was they would sometimes not favor me as a vendor in favor of some of their other customers, meaning that if another customer was having an emergency or had maybe paid them a higher hourly rate, that I might actually get, in a second, third, or fourth position in terms of priority. And so by having full-time employees, it allows you to more closely control where they're spending their time and their efforts. And that, of course, adds a lot of power to your business. So I love contractors and freelancers for gap filling, for kind of pushing your capacity beyond what your core team can do. But you definitely need, in my opinion, you need that solid crew of full-time employees. And that's a big step. But there are ways to go about that don't burden you from an operational perspective. But it will be a burden. But there's some ways to kind of alleviate that as you go about that.
I would love to dive into this sooner. One thing that for me always was a big roadblock in hiring people is the mental aspect of being responsible for the income of somebody else and potentially the entire family being dependent on that income. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure, that weighed heavily on my mind. There's also the aspect of, having to make payroll, and that is a new pressure that you don't have before, that you didn't have before you hired those employees. So if you don't make payroll, they don't make their rent, they don't pay their car payment, and their families are affected. Having that experience in running my own agency and dealing with those pressures and thinking about the impact of my decisions and my strategy on the people's lives has carried with me since leaving running my own business, even now at WP Engine. Before lockdown, I would walk through the halls and look at people and be like, I'm kind of responsible for part of these people's future. So that actually stuck with me even after running the agency. It was such a big part of my life for a long time. But yeah, I mean, if you want the rewards of a growing business, you're going to have to accept some risk and some responsibility. And being responsible for people's lives via their income is part of that. And it is scary. But in order to get bold results, you have to make bold moves. And this is part of what growing a business means. But yeah, that's definitely part of the hump. In having a solid business where when you make that hire, you're not concerned about that payroll, the first one. Like build your revenue up into that point. Don't like fake it till you make it and hope you make that first set of payrolls. And actually my first hire was a very junior person who was right out of college, had a marketing degree, who I hired as a junior marketing administrator. So I did not start with a, near six-figure employee. I started with someone smaller who could help me alleviate some of the pressures in my day-to-day, be able to bill hours to customers. Of course, that was important as well. But I actually started with a cheaper hire to kind of work my way into it. And then as we built up revenue in the business and had more kind of security, I would layer on that next hire. The other thing I would do is I would look at my freelancers and how many billable hours they were hitting. And if it added up to a certain amount, then that meant I could justify a full-time hire. And it might not all be within the same person, but this was how I kind of managed the flow of how many freelancers do I have versus how many FTEs do I have. It was really primarily based on like that pool of freelancer hours. And if it had gotten high enough, consistently enough, then I would go ahead and do another FTE and then keep using the freelancers for the filler work.
That is so important. And it's kind of like the chicken and the egg problem. Do you hire before you have the work, or do you have the work and then desperately need to hire so that you can fulfill the work? One thing I would also love to talk about is you mentioned briefly that there are ways to alleviate that stress of managing the team that you hire. And obviously, if it's one or two people, you can manage that quite easily on your own. But then if the team grows, you eventually have to bring on managers. I would love to hear your thoughts on when the right point is to bring on a manager position.
So in my agency strategy, I did not have a very effective manager program. So I had lots of individual contributors that reported to me. We grew to 22 people, and I did layer in managers, but I didn't do that early enough, and I wasn't effective at how I implemented those leaders. If you have a partner in the business, that's wonderful. Of course, partners come with their own complications sometimes, but having those leaders in your business is critical. And what I found by not having a good leadership practice originally was that we were a full service agency. So we'd do design, we'd do development, and we'd help you market your site. So we had teams that did the different things. And as a kind of singly focused leadership structure, what would happen is I would go from team to team, and have a fairly broad knowledge base. And I would go to the first team and I'd be like, no, look, this is how you spin the plate. And I would teach them how to spin the plate. I'd go to the next team and I'd teach them. And I'd go to the next team. I'd go around the way. And I'd come back to the first team and the plate's wobbling and like 3 plates are on the ground all broken. And what I found was that we had, information decay. I told them how to spin the plate, and they forgot parts of it, maybe got a little lazy. They're good people, but this is human nature. And the plate spinning got worse over time. And so I was spending basically all of my time circling between teams. When I eventually adopted a structure of mentoring and enabling leaders, what I found was that those teams actually became better plate spinners than I was. So I would kind of come back around the circle, and now all the plates are spinning and there's little laser beams keeping them stable and all kinds of stuff I never would have thought of. So my recommendation is, managers are more expensive. It's harder to get billable hours out of managers, but that is possible. But I would say that in my agency days, a lot of my, stress and additional work and inefficiencies were really being introduced by not having a strong leadership structure in terms of managers. I definitely recommend you look at that sooner than later. But you have to balance that with the fact that you're going to be paying salaried employees that may or may not be contributing materially to your billable hours.
Yeah, that's really important. And that's also something that probably you can counterweigh with the expected increase in productivity and billable hours from the team that they are going to manage. So it's all a numbers game in the end. What are your thoughts on educating and making managers, if you will, turning team members you already have and mentoring them, as you said, in a leadership position? How would that work?
Yeah, hiring from within or hiring from without, if you will, for manager positions. I think both are effective strategies. I think it really boils down to the individual. In my belief, leadership is not tied to people leadership, meaning people management. So as I look for people within a team who I might be thinking of elevating, I'm looking for their ability to influence others, their ability to optimize operations and do things more efficiently. And that's not always the most technical or best designer on your team. And so that's what I look for, at least when I'm looking for people that are, working in an individual contributor role who might be a good fit for a manager. Now, the benefit from hiring within is they know all your systems, they know all your problems, they know all your people. You can create some resentment within the team if you promote one person but not the other. But that is something you can manage around. Hiring an external manager can often alleviate that aspect, because you can say, well, this person was a leader doing this over there, and so that's why we hired them over here. But these are all things to consider. You just need to do the best thing that's right for your business. But I am a big fan of finding those individual contributors, figuring out what their career goals are, and if their career goals are aligned with managing people, supporting them in that journey and looking for those opportunities to promote. My career was driven, at least my career when I was working, as I've worked for companies, has largely been, driven by these kind of internal promotions, if you will, versus me like switching a job and going somewhere else. I'm certainly grateful for the opportunities I've had. And, as someone who didn't finish college and on paper doesn't check all the boxes that people might look for, having those opportunities with people on your team to stretch them and give them exposure and challenges they didn't have before, you might discover something really valuable in your business. So my answer is both, but it really just depends on the company and the individual.
Yeah, I kind of expected that. And I just wanted to tell all the people who are watching this is, if you have any questions about this, interrupt us, just leave a comment. I'm not sure if I made this clear in the very beginning. Yeah, raise your hands or shout at us if necessary. Type in all uppercase and we will make sure that we get your questions answered. Now, we talked a lot about hiring and promoting from internal and external. What we didn't talk about yet is a little bit about the vetting process that goes beforehand. So I would like to hear your thoughts very, very briefly, because that's not a question that we outlined originally, but it just seems like a good topic to talk about now. Is how do you go about finding the right people and making sure that you are hiring people that are a cultural good fit?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think one thing to quickly note for small business owners is definitely research what you're allowed to ask and not allowed to ask in interviews. Each country will have specific things that you can bring up and not bring up. So topics that seem really familiar to bring up in a conversation like an interview might actually be out of bounds for whatever jurisdiction you're doing your interview in. So keep that in mind, because as a small business owner, people tend to be kind of maverick with how they do things, but there actually can be some legal implications to that. But in terms of vetting people for jobs, one of my favorite moves, I mentioned how I'd kind of have a group of freelancers kind of doing backfill and overfill work. So within that, of course, you're kind of trying people out. Like, this person delivers on time, they do good work. And so that's one way to kind of naturally get a feel for how someone will operate within your team. My best employees in my agencies were freelancers before they were full-time employees. Then I think of vetting through the lens of freelancers and then full-time employees. So for freelancers, one of the techniques I would use, you can do code tests and interviews and things like this and see their portfolio work. And that's all pretty fine and good. But what we'd actually do, we do all that. But in addition to that, we would give people a project for a customer. Now, this wouldn't be, we wouldn't, we give them something with a long deadline and something we could redo if they mess it up. We'd pay them for it. We would just pay them to do the project. And if they messed it up, we'd throw it in the trash and not do business with that individual. And then we'd redo it and give it to the client. But that was kind of a neat way to try people out, deliver value for customers in a quality controlled way, and then have a kind of an out if it didn't work out with their quality of work. In terms of interviewing people for your team to be a full-time employee, you talked about this notion of culture fit. So again, kind of pushing aside the technical things like code tests and, do you have this experience or that experience? One of my top recommendations, and this transcends hiring, is to come up with a list of company values. WP Engine, by sake of example, has 5 core values that define how we think about our company. They're things like customer inspired, do the right thing. Our give back initiatives are kind of encompassed in one of the core values. And that really helps to define what your culture is. Your culture is defined by your values, not your individuals. And then also look out for traps in this word culture. In Austin in the early 2000s, the startup culture meant work hard, play hard. We drink beer at the office. We go out to bars late at night. And for people that don't want to do that, for whatever reason, religious, personal, or otherwise, that's exclusionary behavior. So think about your core values and your hiring principles, not like, would I have fun going out for beers with this individual, but rather do their work values match the values of your company? But be open-minded to what this notion of culture means, because we can often use culture as this trap to define a type of individual. And that's not at all what you should be building in your business. You should be thinking about it through the lens of values and having those values be broad enough so that they're inclusive of all. And watch out for those culture traps of thinking a beer with this person means that they're a good culture fit.
And culture is a very, very tricky topic. Yeah.
Yes, it gets deep, but as a business owner, you have to watch out for those risks in defining things like culture in ways that are exclusionary. There's legal liability in that in most jurisdictions. But then, of course, thinking about your company's image, you obviously a more holistic and open approach is better for your company at hiring because you have a greater pool of candidates. And then if you externalize that, it's also better for acquisition because your brand is more opening and welcome to more people.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. We have a great question coming in from Michael. When looking to take on your first contractor/employee, how do you get away from that mindset of always being 100% in control when you're doing it yourself?
Well, as someone who loves to JFDI, just freaking do it, I still struggle with this. But I get back to the spinning plate analogy. At the end of the day, all agencies are based on the amount of time you have and the work you produce. Now, some people bill per project, some people bill hourly. I'm not going to get into maintenance plans because that's a whole different thing, but at least in terms of building stuff, at the end of the day, it's time and value. And so as I think about like bringing more people into the mix and not having that control, it's just the way it works. If you want to scale revenue in your agency business, you have to have more people building more things or take on things like maintenance plans that drive monthly recurring revenue for your business. So if it's building, though, that's got to come through people in one way or the other. Now, relinquishing that control, that's plate spinning analogy I gave is really applicable here. You can go from each person and tell them exactly how you want it done, and they're going to forget what you said. They're going to do it slightly a little bit different, and it's going to get worse over time. Your real challenge there, I mean, yes, of course, you need to overcome the hump of not being in control, but the real job you have in front of you is how do you empower that person? Right? As you grow as a leader, you can't be the expert at everything. If you are the expert at everything in your agency, you need to seriously reevaluate how you're managing your team. Because if you're trying to scale your business can't scale beyond you. And that's a problem. So it's not just getting over the hump of providing control, but it's actually leaning into it and saying, if I provided control to this person and supported them in that, what additional value could be given to my business? And usually scaling beyond one person is good for a business.
And you made such an important point that I just want to leave this up on the screen for now. If you are the expert in everything in your agency, you need to reevaluate your team. And it goes back into the notion of if you are the smartest person in the room, change the room, because you cannot grow if you are the smartest person. I totally love this. And it's also so uncomfortable to not be the expert in everything and having to trust that your employees do the right thing at the right time. There is another question that ties into this. I want to bring this up real quick before we continue. That's from Lee. How do you deal with people who seem to be very promising initially, but later on don't seem as good as you thought? My guess, before you answer, my guess is you are a fan, or I would be a fan of hire fast and fire fast. But then obviously that's just my opinion on yours, and I don't want to take your opinion away from that.
Well, you took the words out of my mouth, Jan. Definitely fire faster. If you talk to managers that have had employees they've had to fire, the overwhelming response from those managers is, I wish I'd have done it sooner. And it depends on why you want to fire them, right? If they're coming in late all the time, that could be affecting your billable hours and your income. If they're being disruptive to the team and negative, that could actually have amplified effects beyond just their own contributions as an individual. Typically, though, of course, depending on the situation. So a freelancer, of course, you might fire a lot faster than an employee. And in an employee, you typically want to put them on a very clear performance plan immediately. You need to be documenting the types of events that are happening in some fashion. If you're going to write them up, fine. Sometimes you can send people emails to say, hey, these are the areas that we talked about in that meeting, and these are the areas I'd like you to improve. And you're documenting that. And again, definitely talk to a lawyer on these kind of points. But you're documenting that so that way, if there's disputes in the future, and there could be all kinds of disputes relative to employment, you have documentation that you've counseled the person, you have documentation that they didn't live up to those expectations. And then when you eventually have to let that person go, one, it's not a surprise to that person. I had a really impactful mentor to me once say, if someone's surprised at a bad performance feedback, you're a bad manager. If they're shocked to learn they're doing a bad job, then you haven't been doing your job as a manager and coaching them and guiding them on the right things to do. So again, when it's time to release that person, shouldn't be any surprise. You've got things well documented. Should there be any employment disputes in the future? Again, like, do that quickly. Identify their problems quickly. Coach the person on correcting them quickly. And if they're not correcting, and balance this with the individual in this situation, but then, quote, fire quickly. Now, that's a pretty brutal thing to say, but as a business owner, you have to make decisions for the health of your business. Like you pointed out earlier, Jan, it's not just you and your money, it's also everybody else's money. And if in small agencies, I mean, even I had 22 people at the peak of my agency, one person could have, quote, spoiled the batch, if you will, with a bad attitude. And so hire quick, fire quick, but document things, give people chances, give them the opportunity to do the right thing. And if they don't realize that, then, it's just time to let them go.
Yeah. And that's a great point. Also, what you mentioned is before you fire them, try to help them meet the standards that you set, and try to help them, to empower them, to maybe teach them something that they are missing right now. And Elizabeth says that in South Africa, labor laws make it really difficult to fire people or to even let them go if they are permanent employees. So just goes to the point that before you fire them, you try to help them. Obviously, I think that's just common sense in human nature, if you will. You don't want to be that business owner that just fires quickly because you make a mistake and shooting the messenger all the time. Because in the end, if you have to fire people, it's partially also your own responsibility, because you brought them on and you didn't do a good job on bringing them up to speed in the first place. And then there's one other thing that I want to bring up really quickly is there have been questions in the chat about the replay. You can get the replay in the WP Engine booth on the summit. It will be embedded there. So no need to stress out about catching this live. If you cannot, it will be there in the booth. And also WP Engine will receive the recording to repurpose it. And it will live on the YouTube channel and in the Facebook group. So with that out of the way, I would love to talk about the 3 types of business professionals that you outlined in our conversation about outlining this session. 3 types of business professionals you should probably retain right away, and why.
Yes. The allies in my business, as I thought about it. So I had quite a bit of business experience prior to starting my agency, so I wasn't completely ignorant to how businesses are run. And I knew I needed some help to cover some bases. We talked about what company structure I might have. We talked about tax implications, hiring, legal implications. So the first stop is, of course, to get a good lawyer. Again, this depends a little bit on your country and what kind of lawyers you might need. I essentially got basically a general business lawyer. It was someone I'd already known. which was helpful for me because I didn't need to shop around a lot. But definitely a lawyer to help you with things like corporate formation, making important decisions around risk related to how you're engaging with your clients and things that might go wrong. And you don't necessarily have to have them on a monthly retainer. My lawyer, I would pay a bit like just like order on demand. Hey, I've got this issue, or I need to do this thing. About how much time, how much will it cost? And that allowed me to kind of piecemeal my legal needs. And then if I had an issue in the future, I just call the lawyer back and say, here's the new issue. I need to deal with this one. And so definitely find a lawyer that you can trust. Corporate formation type activities are kind of a nice place to start. And then, establish a relationship with them so you can leverage that trust in the future if a new issue comes up. The other one is an accountant. Now, this was important for me. I use my accountant for a variety of reasons, but of course, the main thing is accounting for your business. But the reason this is super important is because if you get your accounting wrong, that can have huge tax and personal liability implications on you as an individual. And accountants actually are not that expensive. What I tended to use the accountant for was mainly things like tax filing and then books reconciliation. But I would actually have a bookmaker for the kind of first cut of reconciliation within the books. And then, of course, just logging the expenses and income of the business and helping me to categorize it. Bookmakers, at least in the US, are fairly inexpensive, particularly compared to actual accountants. But these are the three that I recommend that all freelancers and agencies consider adding to their mix of vendors right away: is a lawyer focused on business, an accountant, and a bookmaker.
I couldn't agree more. And when we formed our own company, my best friend and I, a couple of years ago, we had a lawyer do that, set up all the contracts, because we wanted to be safe from all the liabilities that could come with the wrong contract. I do have an accountant. I'm biased for that because my father works for the German financial offices. So if I didn't have an accountant, he would probably be not too happy about that.
It's a good thing for sure. It's a must.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. And he usually saves more money than he costs, actually. Usually he's doing a very good job at reducing tax expenses that I probably wouldn't have been able to. And especially with all the knowledge you have to learn to really do accounting right, and to find all the holes in the laws that you can exploit. It's just a no-brainer to hire an accountant. Couldn't agree more with that.
Yeah, I think our accountant was like $1,500 a year, roughly, depending on the year and what was going on. And then our bookmaker was charging us $50 an hour to do our bookkeeping. So on a per hourly basis, and bookkeeping happens like every month, basically. And the accounting happens generally every quarter, depending on what country and your tax situation is like. So that's why I use the bookmaker for those bookkeeping tasks rather than the accountant, because it gave me a bit of a break on the cost.
Yeah, the accountant charges you like $100 an hour for bookkeeping, and the bookkeeper is reasonably shorter for that.
Yes, and you can use the accountant to check the bookkeeper's work. So that's basically what I did.
Yeah. Michael Wright has just a very, very nice comment. Bookmakers are something totally different in the UK.
Yeah, probably not value adders, value takers. There are. Definitely keep in mind, of course, the context of your country. I forgot the person's name who mentioned the South African labor laws.
Elizabeth,
earlier. Yeah, Elizabeth. There's a lot of nuances to this. One of them is actually, what is a contractor? In Texas, there's a list of like 20 things that either make you a contractor or not a contractor. And they're things you wouldn't think about. Like, you give the person a system to keep track of their time. So if you have like a timekeeping system for your clients, that might qualify as that. If you tell them when to start their work or give them tools, that qualifies them as not a contractor. And there's, in the US anyways, there's federal tax implications and potentially labor law implications to these kind of decisions. So definitely check your local laws, get a lawyer to help you out as well. And I did, I had a lawyer help me with the contract for my customers, our decisions around how we treated contractors and what that meant to be a contractor, all of those things, major decisions, I'd vet through a lawyer.
Yeah, definitely. And to dive a little bit deeper onto this topic, you can check out the session from Matt Frost on the summit. So that is about recruiting versus subcontracting. He really dives into the pros and cons of each of that. But I totally agree. And I wouldn't have thought that just equipping somebody with a tool does not qualify them as a contractor, but rather than a more involved person, to say it that way. So that is something that scares and excites me at the same time.
Well, I don't know, is in the US, each state will have their own list of things. Each country, of course, may either do it by region or whatever. Sales tax is also interesting. So the tool thing, by the way, is like you're a mechanic that shows up for a job and they give you the tools to work on. That was what that was
Is that
rooted.
Elementor? If somebody builds a website and you give them access to Elementor, is essentially it's a tool.
Definitely not a lawyer. Definitely can't answer that question. I think if you were to say we're using Elementor to build this, perhaps that might be safer than here is my copy of Elementor to use. But these are the kind of considerations you need to think about. Sales tax is another one. A lot of freelancers and agencies get into big tax trouble by not charging sales tax, not thinking they do. And in Texas, actually, there's a law that says service-oriented businesses don't have to charge sales tax, essentially, except for web developers. And like they have this one carve out because when web development became a thing, the lawmakers were like, we're not letting them get around this. And they did this thing. And so it's like all services are cool except web developers. And a lot of people in Texas will actually get in trouble for not paying their taxes by not paying attention to that. And we were very risk averse. So we would be very on top of making sure we understood these things. We had legal counsel, and then we were making decisions that would eliminate or largely eliminate risk for our business.
That is so good to know, and such a good point. And people watching this, please just check the laws. And if you are too busy or if you don't want to deal with that dry stuff, just hire somebody to do it for you. Couldn't agree more with this. Now, back onto some more fun stuff, and it ties nicely into what you said with diversifying the risk for your agency. Say we are an agency that just focuses on building restaurant websites. Does it make sense to just focus on that one type of project, or would you recommend venturing out and trying different projects with different types of clients?
This is a personal decision, of course, a business decision for each type of agency. I think the benefits of specializing, we did not specialize. We were a full service agency, which meant, getting back to the plate spinning analogy, I had like 10 or 15 plates I had to go figure out how they were spinning. If we had focused on one type of customer, that would have made operating the business easier. Now, getting new customers was easier as a full service agency. We would talk to a brand and they would say, we need to optimize our PPC campaigns. And we're like, we can help you with that. And then we talk to another brand and they would want to do design or development. We could also help with that. And then, of course, when we finished the PPC project, Jan, I don't know if you've worked in PPC ever, but the first thing you do after you optimize a PPC campaign is you start to work on the landing pages to get that traffic to convert more. So we'd sell them on the design and development. When we designed and developed something for someone, we'd pitch them on the marketing side. And so we never had long-term contracts with our customers, but we had many long-term customers paying us, $5, $10, $15, $20,000 a month, just almost in a retainer way for all this ongoing work we would do for them. So the benefit of being broad is it's easier to acquire customers. It's easier to get that next dollar from your customer. But the downside is you're introducing complexity in your business, which can actually restrict your ability to scale your business. There are a lot of restaurants, maybe, and I know companies and agencies that specialize in things like lawyer SEO. There's a lot of lawyers in the world. So they have a lot of customers to go after, but they don't have to worry about recipe SEO or any other kind of SEO or development or design. They just have to worry about that one thing. And so that allows them to have more efficiencies in their business, their training, their documentation, how they optimize their business as leaders. And so if you're going to go broad, just be prepared for a lot of work and a lot of complexity, and think long and hard about whether you should go narrow, because there's a lot of benefits in going narrow that will often overcome the advantages of going broad.
What would be some warning points that you would consider being signs that you are too broad in your agency?
I mentioned the kind of information decay aspect of running an agency, where you kind of run from group to group and optimize, and things get worse over time. When you come back, if things are always getting worse and you've enabled leaders, then that's probably a sign that you're too broad. Being narrow, again, adds those efficiencies, and you feel it. I mean, in my agency, I would jump, and we did various things over the 5 years, but I would jump from like, we're going to make you an Android app, to we're going to make you a WordPress website, to we're going to do a PPC campaign. And for someone with broad interests like me, that was actually exciting. I love jumping from project to project and learning new things and mastering new things. But my passion for diversity and thought and projects does not necessarily equate to efficient business practices. And so if you're pulling your hair out and having to jump from topic to topic to topic, that's usually the sign that you've maybe spread yourself too thin in terms of what your team focuses on. It's also harder to hire and develop leaders and teams in that structure, because again, I had like a PPC team and a development team and a design team and another kind of team that helped with marketing, plus the operations side. I've got sales and HR and project management and things like that. And all of those things, just every time you add a new kind of thing, it multiplies all of those things by 2. So each new type of project you take on in your business, you're going to have this supporting cast, if you will, of team members. And each time you add that thing, you end up kind of exponentially adding to your team needs, and it makes it harder to scale those teams and keep them happy. I mean, it's also challenging for teams to deal with lots of different kinds of things.
Yeah, I would love to know from the people watching this, what is your philosophy around this? Are you focusing on just one market, or are you this full service agency that David just outlined? Let us know in the comments. I would really love to know. Maybe we can even answer some questions for you around that topic. Also, what is burning on my mind forever is managing the payroll when you have staff. So it is, or it can be, quite painful to manage the payroll, because it is pressure. And as we said earlier, it is something that's just part of growing your business. But I'm pretty sure that you have found some ways in your experience on making that less painful.
Sure. I think from the pressure perspective, as I mentioned, try to build up that revenue base with freelancers and contractors. And then when you have that built up, then convert it into full-time employee. That'll help alleviate some of the pressure. But of course, you still have to make that payroll the next month and the next month and the next month. But in terms of management, and I'll, of course, talk about it from the US perspective, because that's what I'm most familiar with. But paying payroll means things like giving a check to someone, withholding taxes from that check, paying those taxes to the government on a quarterly basis or a weekly basis, depending on the tax, and then taking all of that and kind of accounting for it in your books. So that way, at the end of the year or the quarter or whenever it is you're doing your kind of tax filings, you have a nice, clean representation of that. As someone, when I started my agency, that had some bookkeeping experience, but not a ton, these seemed like incredibly daunting tasks, especially when you're talking about weekly or biweekly activities, quarterly, and then, of course, the big risk associated with getting all this wrong. I had some experience using payroll services prior to starting the agency, and I had used a company called ADP for that in the past. But when I started my agency, I went with a competitor of theirs called Paychex for no particular reason. I can't even recall why I chose that one over the other one. But the fees were actually very reasonable. I ended up spending around $150 a month for them to process the payroll, withhold the taxes from the employees, issue them W-2s at the end of the year, pay the taxes to the government, whatever tax it was, on my behalf. And all I had to do was basically send them a list of people's names, how much they were being paid twice a month. We paid twice a month. And then all the accounting and everything was perfect. I just gave it to my accountant at the end of the year, little forms they'd give me, and that was it. So the management was actually very easy. It was just a very, at least relative to the business, a very low cost, $150 a month roughly for me. I think they charged me like a certain number of employees per paycheck or something. I can't remember exactly how it worked, but the point was the cost burden was low, but the value benefit was just through the roof, because I would have definitely spent more than what is it, like about $2,000 a year on accountant fees, and then certainly my time to deal with it had I not go with a vendor like that. Now, some people are more adventurous with handling payroll on their own, but for such a low price point and such high value, it was a no-brainer for me. So definitely recommend use a service like Paychex or ADP to abstract out those hard parts. I think the other thing to consider is, even if you can do it yourself, isn't your time more valuable working on strategy in your business, helping your clients? Like, just because you can do it cheaper, it actually might be that you're losing money by doing it yourself because you're not spending time in other areas. And this applies across your business, of course.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And Matt also agrees, and he says that there's pros and cons of each. So that is the niching down versus going broad. But if he was to build a new agency, he would pick a highly profitable vertical and just specialize. And he emphasizes the profitable. So
Yeah,
I agree that yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say that if I were to start another agency, I would specialize.
Yeah, same here. And that is probably because, from my experiences, you can implement regular processes much easier when you specialize. So you nail down the fulfillment, the project delivery. And once you have that process down, then you can decide on whether it's worth venturing into another vertical or not. Then Michael just shared that he's just a WordPress designer, but he does very diverse sites. So recent ones range from an animal sanctuary to a ferry company to a foundation for former motor racing. So that is definitely as broad as it gets, Michael. Kudos for doing that.
Well, sort of. I mean, it's interesting because you have specialty in your what you know, what you do. I'm a designer, and that's what Michael is saying here. So I'm gonna infer a little bit here, Michael. Forgive me if I get it wrong, but your superpower is designing, and these projects are design projects. If you look at the type of companies he's referencing here, they have varied CTAs and calls to action and different ways they monetize. So when you go from like your skill designing, you can just narrowly focus there, and that's okay too. That's another way to get focus in your business. And then, of course, from a technology perspective, we're only going to do WooCommerce sites. We're only going to do e-commerce sites. And then from a business focused perspective, I'm only going to do ferry companies, which probably isn't a very profitable idea. But the point is, you can specialize in lawyers and restaurants and things like that to kind of really hone in on that type of business. So I think like it's fair to say that all of them are worthy of considering in terms of how you focus. But for me, that key is just to have that focus.
Yeah, definitely. And there is another question coming in that ties in nicely. And Michael, if I were you, I would probably focus on the motor racing driver, try to get into that market just because out of personal interest. But also I think that racing itself, or the automotive industry itself, is a highly, highly profitable vertical. And that ties into Greg's question. Any tips on how to find that profitable vertical?
Yeah, it's a very broad question. I would start with what you're good at and what you're familiar with. If you have a background in a certain industry or vertical and you know the lingo and you're comfortable with it, I would start there because that's going to have the lowest learning curve for you to kind of get over in order to make that a key focus of your business. From there, I would focus on the kind of service you deliver. Is it something quick and easy and cheap? Is it something complicated and sophisticated and designed to deliver value in very intricate ways? That'll help you frame up like which vertical or niche to go over, to target on. The most profitable niches in agencies tend to be things like lawyers, restaurants, nonprofits, basically high value service providers, if you will. And so choosing a niche, look at the customers you would serve and how much disposable income they have. I remember one time in my agency, we had a kind of a niche offering that leveraged Shopify that made it a lot easier for things like yoga teachers and yoga studios to leverage Shopify to schedule classes and charge for classes and things like that. And we were like, oh, we built this cool thing. We want other people to use it. Maybe we'll productize it. Maybe we'll make it a productized service. And so I just started calling yoga teachers and asking them about it. And they said, well, I would never pay more than this for something like that. And this was lower than I wanted to charge for that. So I was like, no, I'm good. I'm going to just pass on this and go on to something else. So do that market research as well. The other thing is, especially if you're kind of a small and nimble freelancer or agency and you can kind of do a lot of things, is you can sell the niche before you actually commit to it. That's essentially what I did with those yoga instructors was I tried to pre-sell it. And I discovered that the price point that they were willing to pay was lower than what I could charge. We had another one for manufacturers that was a system that allowed them to make their inventories more readily available to online retailers. And I came across this idea because we were working with a retailer who gave us these PDFs for these wholesale manufacturer product lists. And we had to convert the PDFs into like products on the webpage. I was like, this is horrible. Let's make a system that abstracts that. So we made a prototype, we called some manufacturers and they said, we don't want to use this at all because at the time they were afraid that the brick and mortar retail people would get mad if they made it easy for the digital retail people to sell the products online. And at that time, those brick and mortar were bread and butter. So we abandoned that. So do a little pre-selling, that's okay. Try to get a feel for that niche you're going to go after.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And if I may add to that, I would also focus on niches that I know have a lot of money in there. So that ties a little bit into the yoga example you just gave. Is yoga studios usually don't make a lot of money. They usually just barely survive, at least here in the local area. Here it is that way. And it's similar with all those small studios, like even hairdressers or something like that. Something that there are many there exist many yoga studios, many hairdressers. So you have this potentially huge market, but they just don't have the overhead to pay you. And that reminds me of something that my friend Mike Killen said. He's he's working with companies that he knows have around 3 to 5 million yearly revenue. He estimates that based on the size of the company, number of employees, for example. So that the marketing budgets, which usually are around 15 to 20%, I would say, can comfortably pay for $25,000 projects, whatever those projects are. But if you know those numbers in your market, it makes it a lot easier to be profitable.
Absolutely.
Just a thought. And Michael just agreed that the motor racing site has been his favorite. I love it. Yeah, why not try to do more motor racing sites in the future?
Yeah, you can flip those projects into a niche. Like if you find a nice niche as a part of a customer, just use that in your portfolio to win the next customer that's like that. We did that all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think if Matt knows that guy you built the website for, then you probably have a very prominent spokesperson as well. I love it. So this is really a nice shift in the conversation. But then, so we were talking about the payroll and then shifted a little bit into niching down versus going broad. But let's dive a little bit or go a little bit full circle here. And let's talk about billing models, because this is, we mentioned briefly that there is this, we have very big projects, 5-figure projects. We have low maintenance retainers. We have the care plans that we're going to sell. What type of billing models, first of all, supports a larger team so that we can make profits and grow? And then what type of billing models are interesting for investors to eventually acquire the business?
Yeah. So from the high level, I think as you think about billing models in general, of course, you need to think about the revenue flow within your business, what you need to support your team, and what you need to support yourself as an individual. And of course, each team is going to be catered to the solution will be catered to what works for them. Before you do any of that, though, and if you're just starting your business or you've been in it for a while and you haven't thought about what would happen when it was acquired, as someone that went through an asset acquisition, I would encourage you to think about it now, because there was some missed opportunity that I had during that exit that I could have potentially gotten a bigger windfall from that activity had I taken some of my own advice that I'll give you today back then. Look for opportunities to get customers on recurring revenue products of any form. The recurring care plans and maintenance plans, potentially reselling hosting, these are all like choice areas to go after, primarily because they do add predictability in your agency. And so when you start thinking about things like making your payroll, knowing that you're going to have $10,000 come in next month from these kind of automated recurring revenue offerings can be a big help in that. Of course, you're also not having to start over from scratch when you have recurring revenue products. So definitely think about like, what is my recurring revenue model, particularly thinking about maintenance plans, care plans, things along those lines. But that doesn't mean you can't get recurring revenue from your clients in other ways. At my agency, we had customers, and what we would do is we worked out a billing model where we had a cap on the maximum number of billable hours, basically their budget for us every month. And we would bill against that cap. So if their cap was 5,000 and we only billed 4,000, they only got a bill for 4,000, but we had this cap to work within. Now, of course, anyone that's run an agency or freelance business realizes that customers never have a shortage of ideas or projects, at least the ones I worked with. And so they would usually fill up that cap at wherever it was. But we had people on $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 a month caps. And that was actually, we had many multi-year, many-year customers who really trusted us and would kind of give us these big retainers in a sense. Now, you noticed I air quoted retainer because it wasn't actually a retainer and it wasn't actually a long-term commitment. And that hurt me when it came time to try to get value out of the business I had built, because customers were not committed to long-term contracts. That meant the value of my agency was lower than it would have been. Had I had monthly recurring revenue products like maintenance plans with this kind of ongoing stream of revenue, and then for customers that I was servicing on an ongoing business, have longer term contracts to kind of at least lock in some of that value for a longer period of time, it would have helped with multiples. For me with the asset acquisition, but for others considering this could be outside investors, it could be your own acquisition in the future. But look for those long-term commitments, look for those MRR type projects. I think in terms of like, I love a lot of the folks that talk about it, growing agency businesses, and they say hourly is not it, sell on value, do project-based billing or things along that, value-based billing and things like this. That's all great. I get it. At the end of the day, in my experience, the agency business in terms of project work, not the maintenance plans, but in terms of project work, is based on how much you charge them, how much time it took you to do it, and how much value they got out of it. You can cut that up into project-based billing, hourly billing, or anything else. But if you charge someone $20,000 in a month, you better have delivered them $20,000 worth of value. You're not going to project bill back your way into getting higher margins by obfuscating work. You're not going to hide that you did $2,000 of work and then you charged them $20K. That's only going to last for so long. So that's how I think about the project-based billing approaches, like hourly, project-based, any of that stuff. It's all the same. It's just like, are you delivering the value to justify what you're charging?
Yeah, definitely. And the session of John White really ties into this nicely, because he has an approach with his True Mountain marketing agency where they set up 2-year retainer contracts for every website they build. So they don't charge 5 figures up front. They have this initial setup fee. Then they split the payment over 2 years. And with that, he has a really stable, predictable income that I would assume makes it quite interesting for acquisition at some point in the future if he were to go down that route. And David, I would love to continue this conversation with you, but I have to be respectful of your time. And unfortunately, we are already over the 1 hour mark that we initially scheduled for. So I do want to thank you very, very much for coming on here, for sharing your experience with this. And please let us know how people can get in touch with you.
Sure. I am on WordPress Slack, so feel free to DM me there if you like, or you can hit me up on Twitter at WP David V. And my
the
Twitter
website.
link's there. Yeah.
The website is there too. The replay will be in the WP Engine booth. So that is wpagencysummit.com/WP Engine. It's also linked in the WP Engine logo, and it's linked on the header menu as well. David, thank you so much. I had a blast. I hope the attendees also got some value out of it. I guess so, from the questions that were coming in. And see you around next time. I can't wait to do this again with you. I have to bring you on at some point in the future.
That sounds like fun. Thanks for having me on.